Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us in the special edition webcast, the third in the SBOM Silver Bullet Executive Series. When it comes to SBOMs, we realize there is no silver bullet to address all of the SBOM needs. The series has been curated to provide you and with valuable insights and tips to help you on this journey. My name is Nancy Richardson, founder of VOC Company, and your host and moderator. Today's special edition features FDA's Dr. Aftin Ross presenting the 2023 IMDRF guidelines, global guidelines, followed by panel and Q&A discussion on their impact. In review of the agenda, next slide. Dr. Aftin or Dr. Ross will be reviewing the IMDRF guidelines as well as relevance. I think there's another section also relative to SBOM and the final guidelines for 2023, followed by the Q&A discussion. I'd like to introduce our panel. Dr. Aftin joins us from FDA currently as the acting deputy division director of DARS, as well as the senior special advisor for FDA's emerging initiatives. Specifically, she provides leadership and coordination in a range of emerging public and health issues, including medical device cybersecurity, personal protective equipment, and incident response. Thank you for all your help and support today, Dr. Ross. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
Absolutely. Good morning, Ken, and welcome. Ken brings a wealth of cybersecurity disciplines, certifications, leadership, and expertise. He serves as a trusted cybersecurity consultant to national and international healthcare industry stakeholders, including FDA and DHS. During his tenure at Bayer, Ken led medical device cybersecurity and is currently serving as a founder and CEO of Vigilant Ops. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you. And looking forward to the discussion and having Dr. Aftin Ross is a special occasion for us. So thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. It's with our regret to inform you that Elisabeth is unwell today. Our thoughts are with her and she sends her regrets for not being able to be here. We look forward to her at our future sessions. In our agenda today, we have two parts. And again, followed by the panel discussion. And we will proceed now. Dr. Ross, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to be speaking about two guidances today, the first being a legacy medical device guidance. It came out of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which many of you might be familiar with. The objective of the Regulators Forum is tried to help to encourage international harmonization in areas that are critical for medical devices, and certainly cybersecurity has been and continues to be a hot topic in this space. Before I get started my presentation, I also want to tell you a little bit about the group that helped to write these guidances. One of the things that is unique about IMDRF is that it brings together regulators from across the globe. It brings together manufacturers from across the globe. And what's particularly unique about our group is that it also brought in healthcare providers as well, because we recognize that for both legacy and SBOM, healthcare providers are a key stakeholder, a key partner. Next slide, please. So I want to tell you a little bit about the presentation outline for today. I think it's very important always to start with why did we even do this? You know, what was the challenge that we were trying to address? Really, what was the purpose? We'll go through some of the changes that we made to the guidance. The guidance initially went out last summer in draft, and we got a lot of public comment and feedback, which we used to refine the final version. So just trying to indicate, you know, the fact that we did intake that feedback and we did make some changes as a result. And then we'll go through some of the different sections within the guidances and then conclude with a summary. So let's start first with, why do we, draft the guidance? And I think we continue to see that legacy devices continue to be a challenge in healthcare. There are a lot of these devices that are still used today because they do still provide some clinical utility. But we recognize that there are certain risk benefits to using legacy technologies. And so it'll be very helpful to think about how we communicate about what that phased approach might look like for those devices that are end of life, end of support, and being able to communicate with regard to those products upfront with healthcare providers to enable them to plan so that they're actually able to phase out those technologies when the time comes, or at the very least, they understand or have the information they need to make an informed decision about how they might be able to manage it once those devices have gone end of life or end of support. The other reason we did this document is because, quite frankly, when we came out with our very first IMDRF cybersecurity guidance, that was total product life cycle. It was just kind of a general foundational guidance. We got a lot of comments, a lot of questions about legacy medical devices, so much so that we could not delve into it in that particular guidance. And so it made for a great follow-up activity. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the purpose and the scope of the guidance. So really what we're looking to do with the guidance was try to provide some more concrete recommendations on how you might apply the total product lifecycle framework that we initially talked about in that N60 guidance here with regard to legacy devices, and to put a little bit more granularity there to help organizations that were continuing on their legacy journey. I also want to talk a little bit about the scope, and this is going to be the same actually when we talk about SBOM as well. Based on the regulatory jurisdictions and where these regulators play different roles, we all have a commonality, and that we are all focused on patient safety, the potential for harm. So that's the context for which we provide all of these guidance documents. We also talk a lot about considerations, including, software as medical device, and also talk about who are primary stakeholders. While there are many stakeholders who could benefit from the guidance, it is geared towards manufacturers and healthcare providers. So let's talk about some of the changes that happened from draft to final. So one of the things that we always try to do is to try to streamline for clarity our documents. And we got a lot of good feedback on some ways that we might do that, how we might be clearer by using more consistent terminology, and we did that. We know a key thing for legacy is related to what are the different roles and responsibilities. And so really took a lot of time to take some of the feedback we received to try to clarify those roles as well as the scope of the document. One of the other things that we did is we also updated and revised the summary figure that we had in the document. We know that when we have these very long, 50, 60 plus page documents, that a lot of times what ends up being very valuable for those that are trying to use it or communicate about it is to be able to leverage the figures. And so we made some updates to the figure to make it more comprehensive and clear. Next, thank you. So before we delve too deeply into the guidance itself, it's very important to understand what some of those key definitions are. I'm not going to necessarily read through all of these, but in particular, I want to make sure that it's very clear what we say when we mean legacy medical devices. That have been an area of challenge in general in the industry. And so it's very important to understand that when we're talking about legacy medical devices, we're not just talking about a sole function of age, which is one context that we hear talked about a lot. We're really talking about a legacy medical device as one that cannot be reasonably protected against current cybersecurity threats. So what that means is that you could have a device that is just a couple of years old, but if it can't be protected, it can't be updated to meet the current needs as it relates to some of the cybersecurity threats, it could potentially be considered to be a legacy device as a result. Next slide, please. So we also like to frame our documents with some general principles. And one of the key ones that I want to call out here is related to communication. What we heard a lot about in commentary as we went through the draft process, and even when we had our very first IMDRF document on cybersecurity generally, where we first introduced the idea of legacy, is that communication is key. And that is very important for healthcare providers to understand when the device might be going end of life or end of support so that they can plan for it, that they understand on both sides what are the expectations or the roles and responsibilities, and that it's very important for manufacturers to try to communicate that understanding of that end of life, end of support date as soon as possible, again, to try to help with that planning. And if that can be done at the procurement or installation stage, that's fabulous. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to show you one of the figures that we have in the document. This is our framework overview. document, it really talks about the 4 stages that we have within the document. It also tries to emphasize the fact, you can see on top we have manufacturers, on the bottom that we have the customer, in our case typically the healthcare provider, that this really is a shared responsibility. And so that's one of the key things we try to do, is to call out what are some of the key responsibilities for each stakeholder group at the different phases within the life cycle. That development stage is really kind of that pre-market stage where manufacturers are expected to incorporate that security by design. Devices in the support stage should certainly receive that full cybersecurity support, such as software patches, software and hardware updates, and other support as appropriate. The manufacturer also at that time can be communicating end of life and end of support dates to customers as soon as possible. And when we take a device to that kind of limited support stage, that becomes a trigger that the customer should really begin thinking about planning for that end of support stage. And the end of support time point really triggers that end of support stage, and devices in that stage are then considered legacy devices. And at that stage, you have a transfer of responsibility to the users. MDM should certainly be communicating that devices end of support, and that there has been that transfer of responsibility, again, for additional clarity with regard to our communications. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that we want to talk about in the document is that while we know that manufacturers might plan for a certain life cycle for their device, that there are things that might happen that might cause there to be a trigger for a transition to an unplanned legacy. And so if this happens, if you have something that's perhaps, sudden, unsynchronized, if there's some, major vulnerability that's discovered in the wild that really leads to the need to have these kind of ends of support declarations and statuses. Also within the document, we talk about what that framework kind of looks like. It talks about some of the questions and considerations for managing that and really trying to mitigate as much as possible needing to go unexpectedly to end of life or end of support. Again, to try to give your stakeholders, your customers, the time that they need to appropriately plan and transition. Next slide, please. So I talked a lot about, communication being one of our key principles here. And so talk a little bit about some of the communications that are discussed in the document across the total product lifecycle. What I will say is that, communications are one of the things that are highlighted in each stage. And that is one of the things that we do try to do within the document, is talk about what key activities are happening as it relates to communication at each stage of the life cycle. And so one of the things that, again, we continue to emphasize is that it's very helpful that manufacturers try to provide information as early as possible, because one of the things that we found in working with our healthcare provider partners is that they find a lot of times that they lack information. And so trying to be as clear and transparent as early on as possible is helpful, again, in trying to help them make some of these risk management decisions. And certainly it's best practice to be trying to provide information on end of life, end of support 2 to 3 years in advance. Also talking about how the fact that the communication between healthcare providers and manufacturers should increase actually the closer you get to that end of support stage, to make sure, again, that the healthcare provider has all the information they need to make informed risk decisions, whether it relates to continuing to operate that device. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about some of the types of communication. There are lots of different communications we expect that occur between manufacturers and providers. And this comes in all kinds of different product security documentation and labeling to provide that additional insight. Also, notifications that might happen at different points with regard to lifecycle changes. Perhaps you did not know when you initially installed that particular technology for an organization when that end of life or support day might be, but notifying them once that is known. And then also certainly providing, vulnerability and patching information as that is needed. We also talk a lot about risk management and transfer of responsibility. That's another big bucket, and we talk about what that looks like at each stage across the life cycle. Certainly, one of the key things we're trying to emphasize here is that technologies do have a limit on their lifetime, and so the closer that we are getting to that end of support date, you're going to have some decrease in manufacturer responsibilities and increase in healthcare provider responsibilities. However, one thing I want to highlight is that even after end of support, that does not mean that all of the manufacturer's responsibilities have gone away. There are certainly certain post-market activities that manufacturers would be responsible for, continue to be responsible for, even the end of support stage, just because the devices are still in the market based on which jurisdiction they're in. So did want to make that point as well. It does not absolve manufacturers of all, responsibilities. Then let's talk a little bit more about what that means from a risk management, perspective, from MDMs. When we are talking about, incorporating security by design, we talk about that a lot. That's certainly something that manufacturers can do in that design development stage throughout the different life cycle stages, thinking about how they manage those third-party risks. And again, trying to emphasize that communication of when those end of life and end of support dates might be. When we think about the transfer of responsibility, again, trying to make sure you understand what your jurisdictional requirements might be, even at that end of support stage, making sure you're providing all the needed documentation to the healthcare provider to help them and trying to manage the risk of that device, as well as providing those information on those upgrade options. I think, the desired state is to not have devices persist, in that legacy state forever, to actually be transitioning to those more secure technologies, going forward, and making sure that everything is clear when you're doing that transfer responsibility to the healthcare provider. From the healthcare provider side, when they're thinking about, risk management, they really need to be thinking about how they might be able to manage those risks and really trying to do a true assessment of what their capability might be to do that. Also trying to make sure, again, on the flip side, while the manufacturer should be providing that documentation, they should also, on their end, make sure that they have received things that they need and really consider what their capabilities are to continue to operate the device beyond end of support. And certainly they need to think about how they might consider those upgrade options as well. So shown here on this slide is a summary figure. It really does just try to highlight some of the things that I talked about just generally as we went through kind of the big buckets of topics that we talk about. So the risk management, what that looks like from both the manufacturer side and the healthcare provider side, what those communications look like across that life cycle, as well as those risk management activities. The other reason that I also like this figure is because it also shows you where in the document you might find some of the additional information on these sections if you want to take a little bit deeper dive or you have additional questions, and certainly trying to again clarify that as we go across the life cycle, we get closer to that end of support stage that we are having some of that transfer of responsibility to the healthcare provider should they decide to continue to operate it beyond that end of support date. Next slide, please. So the very last thing just want to highlight is that, certainly there are compensating controls that can be considered after that end of support date. And we do have a section in the guidance that talks about that, as well as how healthcare providers might want to think about what resources they actually might have to be able to implement those compensating controls. So certainly the compensating controls exist, but a healthcare organization does not have the capability to institute them, then that's something that they want to think about as part of their risk assessment and going forward to use that legacy device. And then the last slide helps to tee us up actually nicely for our next conversation, which is related to the software bill of materials. And so we're going to talk about the SBOM in the next part of the talk, but I think many of you are familiar with the fact, since this is a whole SBOM series, that this really is just kind of, the list of our ingredients list here, and how having an SBOM for legacy devices is certainly beneficial. We recognize that there are challenges with creating or generating an SBOM for legacy devices, but certainly there's a lot of value in manufacturers making a best effort to do so, and thinking about how they might use different tooling or things to help them to do that more retroactively, since that was not something that was done generally as practice upfront at that time. And so really want to thank everyone in the work group that was involved in all of this work, as well as IMDRF itself. So now let's talk a little bit about software bill of materials, which I know has been the primary topic of this series. Similar to the last talk, we're going to talk a little bit about why we drafted the guidance to give that context, to talk a little bit about the purpose and scope, as well as some of the changes that have been made. We'll go through some of the key definitions, as well as some of the different sections in the guidance, and then we will take any questions. So the reason that we, drafted this guidance is because we recognize that devices today incorporate large amounts of software and from all different types. And so these software have the potential to have vulnerabilities that can be source of risk, right, to patients, as well as to then potential health outcomes. And so we know that as software, ages, it becomes unsupported. And so really understanding what is in a device can help you in your risk management activities across the TPLC. And we also received a lot of comments about SBOM when we came out with our first IMDRF cybersecurity guidance, so wanted to be responsive to that. So in this particular guidance, we're also trying, again, to provide some practical recommendations on the implementation of SBOM, as well as try to increase the transparency in the use of software and medical devices. Similar to the last time, we have the same scope that we had for the legacy document, really trying to scope and focus on patient harm. And again, our primary audience is our medical device manufacturers and healthcare providers. So I'll talk a little bit about what some of the key changes. Again, there are always opportunities, and you get a lot of great feedback on how you might try to streamline the document, enhance clarity. Also received feedback on trying to be more consistent with our terminology. So we did that as well. One of the key things that was a little bit distinct with regard to some of the feedback that we got on this document that was specific to SBOM is really trying to contextualize SBOM as just being one of several risk management tools. SBOM is not going to be our panacea here. It's not going to solve every problem that we have, but it's certainly going to be an important part of our risk management, lifecycle management going forward. We also did some updates to our figures here as well, and it did, again, tried to clarify roles and responsibilities. So one of the key things that are important to talk about with regard to SBOM are really, what is, certainly what's an SBOM, but also talking a little bit about, what some of those minimum elements are. We know that there has been a lot of work in the US that was initially spearheaded by NTIA that's now been taken over by CISA, where you've had a lot of different stakeholders come to the table, come to some consensus about what some of those minimum elements might look like. And so we tried to take from that and include that in this international guidance, again, trying to help with some of that harmonization, standardization, at least for starting points. So let's talk a little bit about this figure. So this provides our framework overview. It gives a showing of where some of the information is contained actually within the documents. You can also kind of use it as a visual TOC, if you will. But it really tries to show that information sharing is enabled and transparency is enhanced when you have SBOM generation ingestion between manufacturers and healthcare providers. Under the framework, there are considerations for both medical device manufacturers and healthcare providers that are given. And really at a high level, we can see that the SBOM content is collected by the manufacturer. It's then housed in a software component repository. And then this device SBOM is compiled and generated by the manufacturer and released for distribution. So it can be ingested and leveraged by the healthcare provider. So the next figure provides additional granularity regarding SBOM management across the total product life cycle, across the secure development life cycle, including collecting the SBOM content, generating an SBOM, distributing an SBOM, and maintaining the SBOM content, which is also inclusive of vulnerability monitoring and change management. So during the software development lifecycle, or the SDLC, stages of design, code, build, test, there are various types of software components that are incorporated into the medical device. And so the SBOM content for these components should really be collected and stored in the manufacturer's software component repository with other related information as part of configuration management activities. And then this SBOM should be generated from the repository and distributed to the healthcare providers as part of that deploy release phase activity. The healthcare providers can then get the SBOM during the procurement process or at the time of software release. And after the SBOM is released, vulnerability monitoring can potentially trigger change controls to relevant software components. And then this can also feed back into the SBOM content collection in the software component repository itself. So here are some of the considerations for the healthcare provider, some things that they may want to think about and as part of their ingestion and management. We would always hear about the fact that having an understanding of the current assets is very critical. And we also recognize, and this is something that NTIA also pointed out as well, that to be most useful in SBOM really should be machine readable. And that it's important to have those confidential communication channels between the healthcare provider and the medical device manufacturer to try to protect that information. There's also interest in healthcare providers having a SBOM repository that can bring together the information that they receive from the various manufacturers, and they certainly have some considerations with regard to that, certainly security being one of those. So let's talk a little bit about the SBOM use cases, and these parallel very nicely some of the different use cases that were called out and some of the work that's been done by NTIA. So certainly SBOM can play a very important role in risk management across the total product lifecycle, both for manufacturers and healthcare providers. We can see how SBOM can be used to better understand and assess cybersecurity risks. And that it's very helpful to have SBOMs and to have that be part of the conversations for risk management, even at the procurement stage. Certainly, SBOMs can help with vulnerability management. We recognize, new vulnerabilities are going to emerge, and they certainly aid in understanding what software might be contained in that device, and that certainly helps understand whether or not you might be affected, and so that you can take any potential remediation steps. And then certainly for incident management, helps again to understand whether devices might be impacted. So we talked in the last presentation already about the fact that the software build materials and legacy devices are connected. So I don't necessarily have to go over this slide again because it's actually identical to the previous slide, but part of the reason we released these guidances together is because we recognized that they had some interplay, some interdependencies, and so we thought we would be providing additional information to the sectors, the ecosystem, if we could put them out in parallel. And now I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross. That was a lot of information, and I can't believe how much information we were able to go through in such short order. That's an immense amount of effort in there and guidance for all of our audience as well as the marketplace. Ken, did you have some questions that you wanted to ask Dr. Ross?
Yeah, well, yes. So thank you, Dr. Ross. That was amazing. Great amount of information. I couldn't agree with Nancy more. That's a lot of information to get through in that short amount of time. And so, yes, so a couple things real quickly, orders of business. One is we have a Q&A opportunity. So for folks on the call that want to type questions in, please send those into Q&A and we'll get to those as we can. I think maybe I'd like to kick it off with just saying, it looks like kind of one of the overarching themes, let's just say one of them is this communication mechanism, which makes a lot of sense. So communicating from, say, producers to consumers, or as we call it, medical device manufacturers to HCPs, is one good pillar or a good strategy in order to kind of shore up this balance with respect to cybersecurity and protecting devices. One question I think that is maybe on a lot of folks' minds is, given the overwhelming amount of information, the overwhelming amount of guidance documents and legislation and regulatory requirements, do you have any thoughts or suggestions on maybe scoping this for a medical device manufacturer, maybe where they should focus on maybe satisfying the most pressing needs for HCPs?
No, certainly. And I think, some of that might still vary a little bit, from manufacturer to manufacturer, depending on where they are in their, journey. with regard to their, cybersecurity journey. But I do think, it's certainly helpful to think about what are some of the critical areas that you might anticipate, right? And we've heard lots of different, challenges in the cybersecurity, landscape. We've heard things about, interoperability. We've heard things certainly about, vulnerability and general, risk management. So one of the key things that we have found certainly is, having your policies, practices, and procedures certainly in place, but that enables you then to be able to communicate with your customers about what they would expect, potentially what cadence they might expect it, how they might expect to get that information. And that certainly aids in their ingestion and understanding that. I mean, certainly even with working with your regulators, we like to communicate with our stakeholders, and having those open lines of communication will help you to kind of navigate, some of those pressing needs. But some of that might depend, quite frankly, a little bit on where you are in your own cybersecurity journey within your individual institution.
That makes a lot of sense, and so it's kind of somewhat, as you mentioned, a little bit dependent on the manufacturer themselves, where they are in their journey, how they've implemented process. But still, that important piece is communication, kind of getting out ahead of the curve. It sounds like is what you're emphasizing. So that makes quite a bit of sense. We're getting a few questions in through Q&A. I'll look through those, and let me throw the first one at you if you don't mind. Somebody asked about the role of secure software development. So we have the total product life cycle. You pointed out that diagram as part of the guidance document, which I think is great. Really emphasizes the different stages with respect to the device and the transitioning. This question is more about the integration of secure coding principles within those IMDRF guidance documents. Wonder if you have any comment on that.
No, so I think the general principle of our IMDRF's cybersecurity guidances, and these really build upon the very first one, is that, it starts with design, right? Everything starts with design. If you can think about how you're going to do that, secure coding at the time of the development, it's going to be a lot easier. We hear this all the time, to think about it upfront versus trying to bolt it on later on. You're going to end up with more robust, more thoughtful, more, quite frankly, agile designs, which is really what we need to all be, continuing to move towards. Because it's not a matter of if you're going to need to update your device. It's about when. And so trying to think about that at the outset, certainly going to make it a lot easier to do some of the other things that we're recognizing as, good, best, practices now.
Great answer. And that makes a lot of sense. So the idea is get that security upstream, push it as far as you can up into design, and not just have a bolt on. So that's a good answer. Thank you. The next question that came in was one about interacting with IMDRF. So specifically, medical device manufacturers like Philips, GE, Siemens engage with IMDRF. How do they do that? How do they reach out to you? Are they members? It sounds like maybe the question is about, how do folks engage with IMDRF?
Certainly. So I can give some perspectives on that, and I can give you my perspective and understanding from working within the cybersecurity work group. But my general understanding is that this is similar throughout the different work groups. So the way that membership in the different working groups is determined, it's through the International Trade Association. So here in the U.S., we have trade groups that are part of are under the umbrella of the broader international trade groups, and they go to those international trade groups to solicit for participation in the different working groups. And then that's how we get our working group members from the industry side. With regard to, and then there are certainly countries that are part of IMDRF, and all those countries have an opportunity to participate. Those regulators have an opportunity to participate in the working group if they desire as well. And then for our particular work group as well, we did a call across the different jurisdictions for healthcare organization partners as well, because that was, again, a little bit unique to try to bring in that perspective because of the key interdependencies that we have here and that kind of shared responsibility. So that's how our working group was formed.
That makes sense, and hopefully that answers the question for Q&A. Maybe just a quick follow-on that might clarify things too. I heard you mention, and we know IMDRF is a global a body that's looking at regulation around the world. And I guess part of the function of IMDRF, Dr. Ross, is to align regulatory requirements around those jurisdictions. Is that correct?
It's intended to try to help to accelerate the harmonization of activities across the globe. We recognize that a lot of manufacturers are global manufacturers, and it makes it easier, more efficient for them to be able to try to implement something across the board versus having to do everything jurisdiction specific. That is why a lot of times you'll see in IMDRF documents, they're really starting with the foundation. What are the baseline items? It doesn't mean that a given regulator might have something else that might be a little bit more unique, but we're trying to harmonize as much as possible on some of those key baseline items so that it makes it easier for us to come towards that regulatory harmonization and convergence.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, thank you. That was great. Another question from Q&A. Can you talk about the synergies of FDA and IMDRF? In other words, how do they work together for the good of medical device cybersecurity?
Right. No. So part of the reason the FDA engages in IMDRF, certainly we see a lot of value in it, and it's because, again, it helps to raise the baseline generally, and I think that's what we all want to do with regard to cybersecurity. In a lot of these documents, we're talking about some of the general, best practices and some of those key principles. That's why, again, a lot of times in our documents, you'll see those key principles, because if you can really start and harmonize there, you're going to see a lot of the things that you would like to see in terms of the sector's continued growth and maturity in cybersecurity. So that's part of the reason that we participate and we find value in it, is because it enables our manufacturing partners to further kind of align on some of those best practices and principles, which helps everyone. And certainly it helps patients, which is everyone's, target. We are all in this business because we want to help, patients. And so doing these types of international harmonizations helps with that.
That's a great point. And I think you made that point earlier, which you're exactly spot on, that at the end of the day, that this is all about patient safety and patient security. So anything that we can do, as you mentioned, to get us toward that goal as an industry, as a global industry, is very beneficial. So thank you. That was a great answer. And we're going to swing back to SBOM for a second, if you don't mind. We've got a question on SBOMs. So the question is the SBOMs. Well, it starts with a little bit of a statement. SBOMs, we know, are a valuable tool. As you mentioned, they're not, and then this webinar in itself says they're not a silver bullet. You mentioned that they're not the only arrow in the quiver, so to speak. There are other security practices, principles that should be applied as well. But we know that they're an important piece of this. The question is about sharing. There's a concern in some cases, it sounds like, with sharing some SBOM information with outsiders, if you will. Do you have any comments on the risks versus the benefits potentially of sharing SBOM information, and why it's important to get that information out there versus to feel like it's more proprietary?
Right. And so no one is necessarily to say, to go put every SBOM right on the internet for every single person to be able to get. We know we're going to have to start with some of the secure, and that's part of the reason that I think you might have noticed on the slides we mentioned about, having those trusted channels for sharing that information. But it is very important to share that information. And the reason is because you can't do effective risk management if you don't know what you have. And the SBOM is really a key component to help you to understand what you might have and whether or not you might then therefore be affected. And it allows you to put potential interim mitigations in place, even while that issue is still being investigated by the manufacturer, before they might be able to put in some more permanent controls. There's certainly, compensating controls or other things that you could potentially do, but you have to know whether or not you're impacted. And the same is true for a manufacturer, right? There's a benefit to having SBOM for a manufacturer just as much as there is benefit for having it on the provider side. But as we know that our manufacturers are maturing, so are hospitals, so are healthcare organizations, and they also have some additional capabilities to be able to do some things in the meantime. And what we don't want to have happen is to have a potential patient safety issue that could have been averted if we had understood that we had something that we actually needed to be trying to be protective of.
Thank you. That makes sense. So in a lot of ways, those benefits do outweigh the risk with respect to providing that information. Again, from a communication perspective, that seems to be the important mechanism. I think we might have time for one more question. It looks like this one is back on the legacy side. So you mentioned the total product life cycle and transitioning from stage to stage. This question specifically between end of life and end of support. Are there any recommendations or any things that a medical device solution provider or manufacturer should consider as they plan this transition from end of life to end of support?
No, certainly. So certainly one of those, right, is communication. We don't want for an entity to find out, a couple months before, something went end of life or end of support. That's not going to put anyone in the best position possible. So really thinking thoughtfully about how and when you're going to be communicating this information to your customers is super important. Also making sure that you have the needed documentation. So we know that there are going to be some customers who are going to do a risk benefit assessment and decide that the clinical utility of that device outweighs the potential cybersecurity risk. And there might be some things that they can do on their end in terms of compensating controls that they think would allow for that device to continue to have service. And so making sure that they have the information, the documentation that they need to make some of those decisions or make some of those potential compensating control implementations is going to be very helpful. And again, this is part of the general conversation we're saying the manufacturers need to be, having anyway with regard to providing that product security, documentation, to customers to help them do general risk management. It's even more important to make sure that they have that information as we're heading toward that end of support stage.
That's great. Thank you. And again, I hear you emphasizing a couple of different ways there. Communication, kind of getting out ahead of the curve, device manufacturers planning a little ahead and allowing their HCPs or consumers that same benefit of planning. That makes quite a bit of sense. Thank you. Let's see, we've got, do we have time, Nancy, for maybe one more question? We have some more coming through Q&A. If we do have, we have a minute or two. Should I pull one out?
I know that Dr. Ross is on like a 3 or 5 minute deadline. How is that good for
That's
you?
fine.
Dr. Ross?
I can take an additional question. Please
Okay.
go ahead,
And then
Karen.
we have a quick slide wrap up of key points. Sure.
Cool, great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ross. So real quickly, we hear a lot about shared responsibility. So this question looks like it's around shared responsibility. Maybe could you talk a little bit more about that and the role that you see both the medical device manufacturer and the HCP playing with respect a little bit more to shared responsibility?
Yeah, and I can talk about it actually as it relates to both documents. That generally is a theme. To the point that Ken is bringing up, in all of our IMDRF documents, we have a theme around communication, and part of the reason we have that is because of the shared responsibility that exists between manufacturers and healthcare providers. So certainly, when we're talking about legacy devices, manufacturers have, a responsibility as it relates to, ensuring the good design and maintenance of the device through that expected, lifetime of that device, and communicating when they understand there to be, challenges or issues, and working interactively with the healthcare provider, with regard to that. And again, as we're transitioning to those end of support stages, making sure that they provided the healthcare provider the security documentation information that they need to inform those risk decisions. And then when we think about it from the SBOM perspective, right, it's a shared responsibility with regard to that risk management and even, some of that, vulnerability management. While we recognize that, manufacturers are going to be the ones who are going to come forward, with the potential patches or updates or things that might need to happen. For example, if you have a vulnerability, that there's still responsibility from the healthcare provider side and understanding that the device might currently be at risk. And again, understanding what they might be able to do in the interim while they wait for that, validated patch or update to come from that manufacturer. So again, that's part of the reason why it's very important to have that good communication, because there is so much shared responsibility for these devices across the product life cycle.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ross.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, what a great session. I mean, it's just been an immense amount of information to digest. I will share our sincere thanks, Dr. Ross, for your time today. Much appreciated. I just want to make sure we've captured some of the key takeaways for our audience. What I heard and what we've reinforced here on the slide is, communication. It just riddled through everything that you said, that how key and important that is, which is collaboration at the end of the day. I think people understanding the draft documents and the changes through to the final documents is important to do that due diligence and time for understanding. And then, there's minimum, elements required in SBOM expectations, for legacy equipment as well as day forward, production, and look to, and this clicks on my engineering side, that, the sooner it's better to go ahead and get into the design phase of your emerging products and get that coded in versus what you used a term of, tagging on or integrating later. And that was especially critical. I mean, I could go a list of takeaways today, but those were the key that we grabbed. Any others you have to add?
No, Nancy, I think you hit the high notes. I mean, really just taking that total product lifecycle approach for all of these different challenges that relates to cybersecurity is going to put us in a much better position. It's going to help to enhance, safety and security for the patients, and that's really everyone's goal at the end of the day. And I really liked, what Ken said with regard to trying to make sure the patients are at the forefront of everything that we do. There's a patient at the end of this, and so we really want to make sure that we're putting forth our best effort to ensure that patients have access to the devices that they need and that they are safe and secure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Ken, any closing thoughts?
No, just a big thank you to Dr. Ross. Lots of great information, and we hope this is really helpful. And a big thank you to the folks listening in. Thank you for the Q&A and the great questions. Hopefully you got a lot of them answered today on the call. So again, big thanks to all.
Great. And just an encouraging follow-up note, we have 2 more webcasts that are forthcoming. And we're looking at, you had some examples there of use cases. Now we're looking for real live SBOMs in action on our next webinar. And then following up with the importance of cybersecurity strategy, how key that is to your business, to your customers, to your communication, to the whole circle of care. I also encourage everyone, please, for future webcasts and announcements and dates and so forth, please follow us on LinkedIn. You've got VOC Company out there, you've got Vigilant Ops and my name, which many of you may have seen as I've posted as well as on Vigilant Ops. And of course, we encourage all of our past and present and future guests to go ahead and share. So please do share with your associations, your companies, etc. And also we're on Twitter. Anything else before we close? I just appreciate everybody's time today, and we look forward to our next session.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.